Our talk is in two halves. For the first half, I'm going to talk about some of the work we've been doing at the Royal College of Art with our students. And then for the second half, Fiona's going to talk about some of our own projects. Basically, the design that we want to talk about today focuses very much on asking questions rather than providing solutions. So we're not trying to narrow things down and solve things so much as open spaces up for discussions. The projects will look at what those questions might be, well, is it worth questioning, how design can even pose questions. And I think the most difficult thing of all, certainly for us, is where would this kind of questioning happen beyond an academic context. So this is, there's lots of very, very interesting things happening in the science world at the moment. Some scary things, some very exciting things. They're bound to have a huge impact on the way we lead our lives. But I particularly like this one example. It's called Victimless Meat. And it's meat that's grown in a laboratory. And it's by two artists called Oren Katz and Ayon Etzer, who work in Australia. And they actually have their own laboratory, and they work with scientists. And so that disc is about 3 centimeters diameter. And on the left there, you can see a kind of degradable scaffolding that the meat's grown over. The meat consists of cells taken from animals that are then pushed into that scaffolding. The scaffolding's placed in those little dishes in fluids that feed it, and it's spun around, so you end up with these circular discs rather than some random shape growing in relation to gravity. And you can see down the bottom right-hand side, it's not particularly appetizing, but it is in fact lab-grown meat. So Fiona and I came across this, I think in about 2003, at a conference in France. And we were absolutely fascinated by the possibilities of this meat. I mean, it was real. You can do it. There are actually conferences happening this year that are exploring how to commercialize it. And we wondered what designers would bring to this technology. And I think we can't get our hands on it and make it or prototype it. But we can imagine how it might enter everyday life. We might wonder how much would it cost and where would you buy it? How big would it be? If you're taking cells from animals and the animals are living on afterwards, they're not being harmed, maybe vegetarians could eat this meat. Maybe you could take cells from humans, like pop stars or politicians, and eat those. And maybe you eat them because you love them or you hate them. But I think design takes something like this, and it has the potential to think about economics, production, consumption, and sort of look at things from a more messy perspective. And by dragging it into a consumer context, it's not to trivialize it, but to activate a different part of our character. As citizens, we tend to think on a very high moral level about whether we ought or ought not to have something. But as consumers, we're obviously thinking about whether we desire it, does it seduce us, how much would it cost, how would it change our lives. So we think that design can be used as a sort of a language, an accessible language to open up discussions about how these technologies might impact on our lives before they actually happen. I'm just going to, we ran one of these projects based on this technology for our students. I'm just going to show one project from that series. And it consists of a video at first where the designer is going to explain the starting point for him.
The meat of tomorrow will be as succulent and tender as that of today. It will be more efficiently produced to a higher quality. Assuming that there are no unforeseen biological side effects, meat grown without the expense and cruelty of livestock farming will become the normal, everyday thing. But we should look closer and ask the question, what will be different about this meat? For one thing, what size will it be? Family-sized? If so, a large family or a small one? What shape will it be? Will we buy it in circles, squares, cylinders, cubes? Perhaps new shapes more suitable for even cooking will be devised. Surely the lamb chop, with its awkward form, which is difficult enough to eat, let alone grow in vitro, would cease to exist. Whatever the answer to these questions, the whole process from production to consumption will more than likely become highly abstract and arbitrary, no longer bound by the size and shape of any animal. But will there be anything to remind us what this stuff is, or at least what it used to be?
So James was very interested in taking this as a potential technology and basically applying design to it in a more aesthetic, cultural way to figure out how to give this very abstract industrial meat some sort of meaning or some sort of connection to the living animals it came from. And in his scenario, at some point, the government would decide that we're no longer going to do farming, but we're going to produce meat in the laboratories. So the most perfect chicken, the most perfect pig, the most perfect cow would all be scanned, and their internal organs would be used as references to build up a new language, and this new meat would be designed in shapes that refer to these animals. So you'd end up with something like this. So I don't think this is 100% appetizing just yet, but I think it's, to me anyway, it's a lot more plausible than the actual real technology that I showed at the beginning. And I think that that's quite important because although this is fake in a way, a lot more people seem to be able to relate to this and think, well, maybe it's not so bad. And then beyond that becomes the possibility to discuss what would happen if we stopped farming and we started to explore this lab-grown meat. Maybe it would have ecological impacts, for example. So I think this is a very, very basic example of how design can open up a different perspective on something that when people are confronted with the actual thing itself, there's an immediate sort of yuck response, and it shuts down all sorts of possibilities. When we started running projects in our department a few years ago looking at emerging technologies, we'd sort of had biotech and nanotech and different tech things. And what's really interesting is that over the years, the students have started to mix everything up a lot more. And a lot of the projects are questioning our relationship to nature and how we can establish different kinds of relationships. Some of them are functional, some of them are more poetic. In this project, Susana Suarez was... It's a large project looking at all aspects of smell, but for one part of it, she discovered that bees were being trained by the military to sniff out explosives. And here they are being held, and the chemicals kind of blow over them. They can be programmed in about 5 minutes. So in effect, they're like biosensors. And she did some more research and discovered that they can also be programmed to smell hormones and chemical traces produced by illnesses in our body. And she became very interested in other applications for bees. And at the end of the study, proposed a set of objects where they're sort of diagnostic tools. You'd breathe into the inner chamber, and there would be some bees placed in the larger chamber that have been programmed to react to particular chemical traces given off by an illness or even a fertility phase or something like that. And then if they detect it, they fly into the small chamber, and you may have that illness, or you may be ready to become pregnant, or there may be something else. And it's not meant to be an alternative to medicine as it is today, or to be put into production, but to kind of try and draw us into a thinking process about whether we could be using insects in a different way to kind of rethink how we monitor our health and so on. We already use animals in so many other parts of our life. Is this something evil that we shouldn't even consider? Or maybe we could go much further and take what's basically at the moment a military technology and explore it from a different perspective. As well as this one, which I really like. She's sort of looked at much more functional tubes that prevent the bees from getting confused or lost. And she worked with beekeepers and bee specialists on this project to really get into what would be feasible and doable. So another project that I guess looks at our relationship to nature from a different perspective is this one by Michiko Nita called Extreme Green Gorillas. And she was very interested in sustainability, but extremely frustrated. She knows something's got to change, but it's very difficult to figure out what exactly design can do. It seems to be more of us as citizens and consumers have to change our behavior. But nonetheless, she wanted to dive in and see if there's something she could add to that topic. So she created this imaginary group called Extreme Green Gorillas, who basically would end their lives at 40 so that they kind of are sustainable. They avoid communicating using technological systems. So this is a map of migratory patterns for hundreds of animals. And they would use the tags that scientists often place on animals to track them, to carry very small messages around the world. So you would become much more aware of the flow of nature the patterns of migration, the seasons and so on, as you would look to them to transmit your messages. And she sort of came up with a notional pricing scheme for slow animals, fast ones, ones that get caught and eaten, ones that escape, and so on. She also looked at the idea of maybe embracing genetics technologies to redesign animals. So taking something like vermin, that there are plenty of, even in a city like London we have rats and pigeons, but combining them with other more tasty food like rabbits and quail. And again, these aren't, you know, this isn't even technically possible, but it's trying to open up a space to say, well, maybe, you know, things like genetics technology, rather than being a source of fear, could perhaps open up possibilities and allow us to deal with these issues in other ways. And just as her mapping thing isn't likely to be implemented, I know that Mitchik, and I agree with her, believes that we have to think really differently about how we address these issues, and we have to use a lot of imagination. And although that may not be a solution, it could be a catalyst to inspire other people that are in a position to actually make changes, to perhaps make those changes. And the project ended up as a set of booklets with the manifesto for the extreme green guerrillas, their communication policy, their food policy. It's hard to see, but the bottom left-hand one is their idea of death, and there's a euthanizing device that ends your life at about 40. Recently, this year in fact, this is a project that's ongoing at the moment, we've noticed that our students are becoming more optimistic and celebratory. And this project by Kat and Zoe started off looking at how nanoparticles could be very harmful if this technology becomes a lot more prevalent. Some people are saying perhaps it's like asbestos, that in years to come there'll be all these unforeseen side effects. And they wanted to set up a project that would facilitate discussion about these issues with the public, and maybe scientists as well. And everything they were coming up was a bit sort of dry and a bit school teachery. And by some, I can't remember the coincidence, but they found out that if you make ice cream using liquid nitrogen, you actually modify it on a molecular level, which is kind of nanoscience sort of space. And the ice cream tastes completely different. It's much smoother because the molecules are sort of interacting in a different way. So they aimed to get an ice cream van and make this sort of nano ice cream, as they called it, and use that as a way of starting off these discussions and so on. But again, it seemed, well, you could be talking about anything really with this ice cream van. So they pushed it further. In fact, they went to talk to some nano specialists, and they were looking into all sorts of related technologies, but they made this kind of sideways leap and came across cloud seeding, where you can actually fire chemicals into clouds, usually to create rain where there's drought. But they, by a slow process of research and discussion, arrived at the idea of making clouds and snow ice cream. And so they have an ice cream van that they're working on, and they basically have talked to Richard Jones, one of the leading nanoscientists in England, about how you might actually go about doing this. And it's kind of moving away from nanoscience now into geoengineering and how you design climates. But the topic would still be to have a discussion about nanoscience. And for our interim show a couple of weeks ago, they sort of made this vapor that was vanilla flavored, and it's cold and it tastes really nice. And they were serving it in the show as a sort of a first step towards seeing how you'd at least create flavored vapor. And at the moment, they're trying to build a test rig to make some experiments, and they're looking into how people do it in the special effects world. And again, create a small amount of artificial snow that's flavored. And they just recently bought an ice cream van, which they're hoping to modify. And I think the important thing about this project is they probably won't achieve this by July, but they want to continue beyond their graduation. And the conversations they're having on the way, the encounters, the discussions are absolutely fantastic. And it's opening up all sorts of unexpected projects for other people, and also discussions with the scientists. And I really like this project as well, because I think in the dire situation that we're all facing now, as a teacher, you sometimes wonder what you should be encouraging your students to do. And it seems harsh to have them all knuckling down and desperately trying to solve problems that weren't their fault, basically. They're coming into this world. So I think there's still room to encourage people to to imagine possibilities, to celebrate possibilities, to try and do things that maybe lead to other things that don't have an obvious practical conclusion at the outset. I'm just going to mention one other nano-related project. With the bio side of things, at least it might be semi-living, or it might come from our bodies, but it's tangible, and designers find it much easier to work with, and there's inevitably all the ethical issues that surround it. With the nanotech stuff, the last project was dealing much more with the sort of implications. With this project, the designer was trying to think about, well, how do you design nanotech? On the one hand, there's the dystopian grey goo scenarios where the world will start to dissolve once it goes out of control. And then the reality is that we have trousers that are stain-proof, super lightweight tennis rackets and other things like that. And when people try to make projects around nanotech, what you find is it's all about coatings. It's about lightweight things, super hard things, super strong things. So he wanted to not do a nano product, but look at maybe how our relationship to the material world would change if a particular idea or vision for nanotech was realized. And he focused on the idea of smart dust, which is a very sci-fi-ish idea, but lots of researchers are working towards it, where very small particles communicate, connect, disconnect, and reform. And he wondered, how might our connection to the material world be modified if this, I guess, this nano dream ever became true? So he made this short video as a to sketch out what he thought might happen. I think one of the things I like about that is that it's impossible to portray a world where smart dust exists. And rather than trying to tell us what the future is going to look like, he sort of froze everything, light, suit, desktop, and so on, and just sort of looks more at it doesn't matter if it's a mobile phone or a printer, it's just how a different form of interaction might occur. And I think that's quite an interesting challenge for designers working in this space, is to identify where is this other place that hasn't happened yet, and how do you present it in a way that engages people. So even though this video is just about moving seeds about, it has some quality that I think works quite well. I'm just going to mention one more project. Although the ones I've shown so far are very science-orientated, we're trying to look also at how this thinking can be applied to other more ordinary or familiar areas of our life. Again, to question, but maybe not so much the ethics or future possibilities of a technology. We set a project about robotics to our students a year ago, and Alice, one of the students at the time, was a real realist. And she found this quote, this rule from one of Isaac Asimov's stories that, robots should not injure or harm a person in any way. But being such a realist, she thought, well, actually, we don't really have robots in our life yet, so it's a bit of a fantasy. So she turned to an Argos catalogue, which in the UK is a shop that basically sells everything, kettles, cookers, all the kind of ordinary things of everyday life. And she went through this massive catalogue that they produce, looking for smart products that maybe could potentially harm us. And she came across weighing scales, which she thought definitely produce emotional and psychological harm, and need to be considered from the perspective of Asimov's law. So she came up with 3 different versions. And although it's a very simple technology, she prototyped them and made them so people could live with them and try them out. The first one on the top left is called White Lies. And it's just a very long weighing scale, so depending on where you stand, you get an accurate or inaccurate reading. The one beneath it is called Half-Truth, and you need someone else, your flatmate or your partner, to basically decide how truthful to be with you. And the last one is called Open Secrets, and it transmits a text message to a friend. And again, you put the onus on them to decide when to break the news to you or when to congratulate you. So, although it's quite a humorous project, I think there's a really serious intention behind it. You know, when you think about the user models the idea of what it means to be human, that as designers we design for, we're super efficient, totally in control of our lives, on top of everything, and that's what you see reflected in the objects around us. But as we know, we're neurotic, complicated, full of anxieties and so on. And so Alice is proposing a world where the objects around us reflect our neurosis. They allow us to lie to ourselves. They do put a pressure on our friends instead of ourselves so we feel better. And I think that, again, although these could be put into production, I think that the value of them really is to open up a space to question again who it is exactly that we're designing for. I'm going to hand over to Fiona now, and she's going to talk about a couple of our projects.
So I'm going to talk about what we do in our studio in Dunne and Raby, and I'm going to pick up a little bit on the idea of that design can be this reflective medium. You know, design is a medium to ask questions and to sort of trigger the imagination in people to do different kinds of things. So we did this kind of robot project, and in many ways it came out of the blue because we had our heads in all this nanotechnology bio stuff. So it sort of just popped out of nowhere, and it was mainly because we were staying in Tokyo at the time, and you know, there is this kind of culture totally happy with and totally immersed in technological things. You know, the technological dream space is already kind of totally absorbed in their culture. So there's always this dream, and it's kind of there, that in the future, robots will do everything for us. It's a persistent dream, and somehow it bubbles up every few years. And it's actually a dream that refuses to go away. And in many ways, it's an impossible dream. But it's very palpable when you're kind of hanging out in Japan. But at the same time, within technology, there's this kind of relentless sort of unthinking road of kind of technological progress for its own sake. And we want to start to question, you know, what that was really about. So our starting point was very kind of narrow and focused in the visual language of robots. We wanted to look purely at kind of their expression. And we were amazed at how limited and narrow the kind of range of possibilities kind of are. It seemed to us there wasn't very much kind of individual identity for robots at all. And we looked at lots and lots and lots of robots. There's the usual kind of super functional kind, you know, the industrial kind that kind of make things in factories. And then that's on one side. And then you've got the kind of ones that are trying to look human, that are getting more creepy and more weird as the nearer they kind of get to us, the whole uncanny valley thing. And then there's a whole set of robots that we don't even know that are there. They kind of completely disappear and become absorbed in our everyday lives, the kind of computing power that goes into the ubiquitous computing of our everyday world. So we wanted to kind of look a little bit more at this expression of robotness. We thought there's huge potential here to play with this. And when we wanted people to see our robots, we wanted their immediate reaction to be, yeah, but that's not a robot. Which, you know, when you see it and you don't see what you're thinking about, you know, you're thinking, well, what is a robot then? You're in this position where you have to start questioning robotness and what it is. And that's exactly what we wanted. That was our aim at the very beginning. So all of them had to, you know, they could not look at all like a robot for 1 minute. So it is this idea about kind of questioning things. So if they do enter our everyday lives, we wanted to think of them not as these kind of super smart functional machines, these pseudo life forms. We wanted to think of them as kind of technological cohabitants. How would we interact with them? What kinds of interdependencies and relationships might emerge with them? We wanted these objects to spark discussions about how we'd like our robots to relate to us. Should they be subservient, intimate, independent, or should they be equals to us? So we did this project incredibly quickly on a very, very small, tiny budget. Literally saw small painted models and a video, which we worked with filmmaker Noam Turan to kind of bring these kind of wooden things to life. So the video was designed to be at the scale, the woman was designed to be at kind of human scale, and it was almost like she was in the room with you. She was kind of nearby, but over there, and in her world, these objects kind of became enchanted and came to life. And it was not to sort of show, the video was not to show how you use them, but it was kind of to suggest that there are these enchanted things that are actually living. So we don't see them as solutions for robots, we see them as starting points. In many ways, they're kind of like a three-dimensional brief, that, the starting point for a project. So I'm going to talk about each one of the objects. So the first robot you're going to see is the red ring. And this robot is, again, incredibly intelligent robot. It's probably, working in a smart home of the future. It's probably doing all the air conditioning, all the communications, and it probably normally would sit in the fabric of the architecture. You would not have any kind of relationship to it at all. And it's incredibly focused at what it does, and it needs no relationship with humans at all. So the only thing we gave it was a kind of sensitivity to electromagnetic radiation. So if it has any electromagnetic radiation, I'll just pause that. So if it if it's aware of anything around it, because it could infect, the electromagnetic radiation could interfere with its kind of processing power, it would kind of move itself up, move itself to somewhere more quiet when there's no electromagnetic radiation, and it would kind of give you a space for the human to perhaps, enjoy, knowing that this is probably the most kind of pure electromagnetic space in the room. And that's it, really. There's no other relationship to this robot whatsoever. The next robot is the black cone, which we were very inspired by Kevlar, the material. It's kind of quite a menacing material. Unfortunately, we didn't have enough budget to do it in Kevlar, so it ended up again being painted. And in many ways, we wanted this object. This object was an extremely paranoid object, quite kind of menacing. So on the front of its face, it's got thousands and thousands of little kind of scanners that are constantly searching and looking all the time, and every single thing that you could possibly measure in a space is being measured. And in many ways, it doesn't know what's kind of what would put someone in danger or not. If it has to make the decisions, it's going to get really, really paranoid, and that's why it's quite jittery. And in our scenario, it seemed that most errors that occur with technology come from human error. So in our scenario, anything to do with humans is problematic. So this robot completely freaks out when it sees any human coming nearby. And the next one is probably one of my favourite ones, as I actually have my iris scan to go into the UK, and I can now actually go back through without any passport. It just literally scans my irises. With this object, it was really about the idea that it kind of acts as a sentinel to your personalised information. So much information now is being in the computer. We have so many kind of passwords and PIN numbers and things to access things. You know, you can kind of imagine that maybe in the future we do take a supermarket barcode scanning approach to, you know, identifying ourselves. But we thought, you know, if these kinds of technologies enter our living spaces, do we really want to be kind of reduced to a kind of supermarket of interaction? So here, we made this object that's not very, you know, again, it's kind of trying to push the language. It's supposed to be a very, very technological object, highly sophisticated, but it's kind of like this big lump of wood that's very awkward to look at. And you've got to kind of hold it in your arms. And the idea is, for you to access your data, you have to stare for a long time into its eyes before, and then it can just double check that it really is, you know, you that are kind of trying to access the data. And the final one is the little white one. And this one's a little pathetic. Again, it's a very super intelligent computer, but we've kind of reduced its abilities by making it sort of, it's got this kind of big round head, and it's got this little kind of body, and it can't move. So basically it's very pathetic, and it constantly wants attention. It wants to move by the window, it wants to be by the fireplace, it wants more light, the person has to kind of constantly be part of its everyday life. And in many ways, this object probably doesn't need the person at all. But, you know, in our world of technology, maybe we need to feel that we're part of that kind of technology. You know, we play a part too. And, you know, in this scenario, we're not really sure who the needy one really is. So, what's quite interesting about this robot space is it sits in this very kind of funny space between fiction and reality. And it's a difficult space to pin down in many ways. You know, to be really effective, we need you all to believe that these robots are really real. They could actually exist in the world. But of course, if they were really real, they'd probably make pretty lousy robots and be really useless to use. But we need that kind of balance in which to kind of engage you in these different kinds of ideas. To keep it positioned in this discursive space of kind of discussion and debate, I think we use two kind of tools to help us with this engagement, and that's kind of satire and aesthetics. They help to keep a distance and to kind of help suspend disbelief a little bit, to kind of create this space. So I'm going to jump very quickly onto the second project, which in this project we really wanted to engage with other people and try and probe what kinds of ideas that other people would have. And it was based on a piece of research we were doing when we were looking at genetics, and it was from Craig Ventnor, who did the final genome, bringing all that together. So basically, he was offering a service back then when they first kind of worked out the whole genome sequencing. And he offered that at that very time that if you were to send a sample of your DNA to him, he would sequence it and he'd work out what potential illnesses you might die of. This was quite kind of remarkable. But obviously now it's a lot more complex than that. It's seen that just because you have a gene doesn't mean to say that you're going to die of it. And of course now we have 23andMe is a new kind of service where you can actually get your DNA kind of sequenced, and these kind of information can be kind of given to you. So it's a very different kind of space, and we wanted to know what people thought about that and how we could use design to kind of generate thinking in people. So we kind of designed a product as a tool to help us do this. So this was the product. It was called Evidence Dolls. And the idea was that it was aimed at young single women the sex and the city generation of young women who are out there in the world looking for a potential partner. And we thought that the future of genetics wouldn't be about the kind of income, status, and kind of looks. It would actually be about your genetic information. Maybe that's going to start to determine, you know, who your future partner might be. Or would it? That was the kind of question. So we made this doll, a plastic doll. It had a flat kind of face. And the idea was that with each lover that you had, you would have a doll, and with your camera, you'd put a picture of his face. We'd put a picture on the face of the doll. You get a black little marker, and you can mark on the body things that you liked or didn't like about this particular lover. And of course, we've got the three very important parts: the penis drawers in small, medium, and large. And in there is where you keep the sample. You know, the hair sample or the saliva sample, or whatever you can kind of get your hands on to get that analysis for you. And so it's quite an evil way of kind of putting it together. But it was a powerful medium. And what this doll enabled us to do was to put an idea into somebody's everyday life. So we gave it to 4 women, and we asked them to rethink about their lovers based on their genetics. And to use the doll to really think about their lovers, and to think about their lives and their families, and, you know, to situate that kind of very abstract ideas and thinking into sort of everyday space. So it's not this kind of philosophical thing that's happening in the newspapers. It's something that they could think about, well, what would I feel like if it was in that situation? What would I actually do? So what we did was we made 100 dolls, we put them on the shelves to look like they were in the supermarket or something where you might buy them. And then we interviewed the ladies, and we worked with designers, illustrators, Abba, who illustrated each of the stories and interviews that we made to give a kind of sense of the people, of the stories that they told us. And then we displayed them. It was for a kind of commission in the Pompidou Centre. So these were some of the dolls. So this was a kind of a philosopher with bad cardigans. We had film stars as well, because in the news there was a whole thing about how George Bush put a piece of a beer glass down, and one of the security people took it away in case someone kind of looked at his saliva or something. So we thought, you know, pop stars or any public people could be in this scenario, fantasy scenario as well. And this was one with a man that had no heart. So these were. And they were putting on videos that, you know, showed the dolls and showed the stories. I'm just going to say a few of the things that came back. So this is one of the things that it was quite nice. I would go and get some DNA stuff tested. There's something romantic about collecting a hair sample. It's like putting a curl of someone's hair in a locket. There's something lovely about that. And that was really nice about this, is that, you know, we'd made quite a cynical, horrible product that, you know, we thought was quite evil and, you know, nasty. And in fact, you know, what was lovely about people is they're always hopeful, and they kind of turn things into, you know, lovely things. So she saw them all as little kind of diaries of her lovers that she would kind of keep. This one I want to talk about. Yes, this is an important one. So one of the ladies said, I find it quite difficult messing with nature, but if you could sample the best of this one and that one and put them together, is it tempting fate? And then she goes on to say, it's incredibly selfish to want the best and not be happy with what nature gives you. But if you can do that, why not? And I think this was very revealing, because all of the women actually constantly contradicted themselves, said, oh, no, I wouldn't mess with nature, I wouldn't kind of mess about with sort of those kinds of things. But if it came available, and, you know, if I could kind of get it, well, of course I would. And that was what was quite interesting. There was a real kind of, you know, separation between you as a citizen and what you believe in, and you as a consumer is what you really want. And those kinds of things, you know, don't really filter up to these very philosophical kind of arguments that get debated. And, you know, that in many ways, that's something that design, I think, can offer us, to think about how we are as kind of ordinary people, and what kinds of real desires are there that we might have to think about. So this is my final quote, and I'm going to pass on to Tony. So everything comes 10 years later. Usually the general public know nothing about it at the last moment, when everything falls apart. It's too late. You can't do anything about it anymore because it's already here. I think we're being kept in ignorance. And many ways that, you know, we're not being involved with lots of this, you know, genetic genetic, complex stuff. You know, it's going on, we're reading about it in the newspapers. But, you know, this is something we think that designers can get involved with. They, you know, we do have the abilities to make things tangible, to make things accessible, and to think about kind of future scenarios and maybe offer a much kind of broader range of ideas. So I'll pass on to Tony.
Literally going to finish with one slide. I think, you know, people say, well, where does this stuff fit? And I think we're trying to insert design into almost like a different chain that doesn't start with needs and things and end up with products, but starts maybe with a scientific breakthrough, ends up with us looking not at applications for that and new products, but more what would the implications or impact be of it if it ever became applied to everyday life on a massive scale. Trying to make that concrete in some way using design, which is really what we've been showing today. And they're not necessarily provoking debate, but even just discussions and conversations with different groups of people about what kind of futures do we want and which futures do we absolutely not want. And then at the end of the day, I guess the work is much more directed towards, on the one hand, the public, but also experts. And that's the bit really, I guess, that we haven't explored so much and we're trying to push forward with now, is how this can all feed back into research and other kinds of activities and hopefully have some kind of effect. Thank you very much.